Hey, hello everybody. Thanks for coming back. My name is Joanne Tompkins and I'm chairing this panel discussion about ACHF. I know you've heard quite a lot about ACHF this morning. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here, so I hope I won't ask any questions that repeat what you've already heard, but we'll also try to expand on some of the ideas that were discussed this morning. So just really briefly in terms of background from me, I am a founding member of AusStage, which is one of the databases that's in ACHF, although I'm not directly involved in this particular project at this time. Now, we have two apologies before we begin. One is Lucy Patterson, the head of Experience Digital and Insights at ACME, what used to be known as the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, and Nina Gray, who is based at UNSW and is an Indigenous Research Fellow. But we have plenty, as you can see, of wonderful speakers here today. So just briefly, before I begin with the questions, I'd like to acknowledge the country that we are on. We are on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. That's the particular group of people who own this particular land that UTS is on, and I pay respects to elders past and present and extend that to any Indigenous people in the room. Okay, now to begin with, I'm not going to actually be the one to introduce every speaker. I'm going to ask each speaker to introduce themselves and in the process answer a question for me. And that question is, 3 years from now, what do you expect ACHF to have achieved for the community, the generic community, or for your community? So, who'd like to go first? I don't think we need to be particularly orderly about this. Scott, okay, Lisa Marie, why don't you go first?
Is this on?
Oh, yes.
You don't have to touch it. Thank you for the provocation. My name's Lisa Marie Siren, and I have kinship ties to the Biripi and Warramai people of the Mid-North Coast. So Nartha Lisa Marie, Nartha Biripi, Warramai Garba. I'm at UNSW as a Scientia, which is like a fellowship, kind of. And I'm in the School of Arts and Media and theatre performance with Baroni and Caroline. I'm just introducing myself. Yeah, I won't be a tick. And I'm also a co-associate dean with my colleague Fabry Blacklock, who works in the museums and gallery sectors in our faculty. That's my introduction. I'm also on the advisory committee. So I'm working with Nina. I'm kind of mentoring Nina a little. And I'm a founding member of Moogahlum Performing Arts, which is a New South Wales Aboriginal theatre company here in Sydney at Carriage Works. And I guess when I was asked for the provocation, I was thinking as a theatre maker and researcher who researches practice about the company really and the way that we have been trying to archive our work since 2007. Much of that sits in boxes. And I guess for me, having access to contribute to the conversation, so having practitioners in symposiums and forums to really talk about their needs. I mean, it's no use building something if, you know, it's not build it and they will come. It's build it and make people feel empowered to own it and take charge of that. So I would see the sector as taking charge of their own data sovereignty and even potentially what it might mean to the sector in introducing roles or creating a kind of service organisation that does some of that work as well, that manual labour, which theatre makers just don't have time to do. You know, they just shove things in boxes and put a date on it, and it's normally in Texter. But also everyone understands how important our history is because we all, you know, make our careers on the shoulders of giants. So I think in 3 years' time, it would be really important for the sector to feel empowered to take ownership of this part of it. Yeah, I think that was it. And I'm talking about the service orgs. I'm thinking, you know, with dedicated roles that do this work, then they might even contribute to an organisation that assists for independent artists, because companies do a lot of the work, but independent artists rely on, you know, I guess the funding organisations to keep that data, to do that work for them, because I know that they're dedicated to assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander independent artists as well. You know, like Black Dance, having Black Dance come in, you know, those, and maybe creating more infrastructure, I guess, for the sector. And this might help with that.
Terrific, thank you. Why don't we jump to you, Chris?
Hi, my name's Chris. I am a professor of drama at Flinders University, and I also run the Assemblage Centre for Creative Practice Research. So a lot of my work is around thinking about the place of creative practice within the academy, within the institution, and trying to advocate for our practice researchers in a context that hasn't always taken care of the types of work that they do. In this capacity, I'm here as the academic lead of AusStage. And unlike many of the people on the panel, I wasn't part of AusStage from the beginning. And the responsibility for leading AusStage's academic activities is something that I inherited through my job. So that helps me answer the question, I think, which is one of the things this project is doing is helping us rethink the relationship of institutions and data sets or data assets. That one of the first challenges that I was given when I took up my role at Flinders was, can you get AusStage off Flinders servers, please? And that was a really provocative, challenging task, right? Because we've always thought of the host institutions of these kinds of data sets as having a kind of responsibility for them. And in our case, the host institution kind of no longer wanted to be offering that service, as it were. So one of the things that this project is doing is helping us think about thinking about research infrastructure as part of an ecosystem, as part of a national ecosystem. And this goes partly to the question that Peter asked, I think, in the previous panel about, well, when will nectar end, right? That when we are located in institutions, and certainly for those of us working in the creative and performing arts, one of the things that we know is we might wake up tomorrow and find ourselves restructured out of the institution. And if that happens and there's no one there to say, wait, hold on, we've got 25 years worth of a theatre database that lives here and there's no one left to take care of it, who's actually doing that work? And socializing that across a larger project, across a larger ecosystem like the Hassan ARDC is I think something that I'm really hoping that we can lead across this project. And I was saying to my colleague as we were getting coffee before that the first thing that jumped into my head when Joanne shared the provocation was I also hope that we're still friends in 3 years' time. Because I think that's really actually important that we get involved in these kinds of projects because we want to work with each other. And sometimes the projects or the funders or the structures get in the way of that. And so you've got this tension, I think, between going, yeah, these are the people who I want to be learning from, I want to be in conversation with, and a project structure that says, okay, well, you're over here and you're over here, and you've got a fortnightly meeting and a steering group and a committee, and actually the work that you got into it to do falls down the list of priorities. And for me, that's another thing that's really helpful about this kind of structure, is that remembering that there's a social dimension to the project, and that we're here because we're colleagues who want to be doing good work and who want to be doing good work together, is something that I'm hoping we can keep in focus.
Terrific, thanks. Scott, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I might jump in here because I'm the lead on the DAO, the Design and Art Australia Online, and I also inherited that database. So to think about what it means to inherit a database that has 20 years of Australia's art and design history in it is something that, alongside Chris, it's really great to think about and to think with on these topics. I guess the thing that popped into my mind most when you asked what you hope the future would be in 3 years' time for the ACHF project. I just hope that the DAO's still alive in that time and that we've found a sustainable future for it. My background, I'm a lecturer in art and design at UNSW, so I'm based in the same faculty as Caroline Ambrioni, but a different school. And yeah, I'm an art theorist by training.
Great, lovely. Okay, Helena, would you like to go next?
Yes, please. I'm Helena Grehan. I'm from Western Australia. Well, I'm not really, but I live in Western Australia. And I'm at Edith Cowan University, and I'm a theorist of theatre and performance studies. I'm involved in this project tangentially or in a kind of advisory sort of capacity. And I'm representing the Academy of the Humanities as a fellow, as well as Ausstage, because I've had a very long association with Ausstage. And because I also have been involved in helping establish a digitisation centre in Western Australia. In terms of what I would like to see happening in 3 years, I would like to say that I'd like to think longer term. And I really, as someone who writes about important Australian and international performance companies and artists, I'd really like to see that continuous story that Brioni mentioned this morning of someone, if you have an artist who started and then they've retired and they may have their box of material, but that there's a central place where you can find out all of the work they were engaged in and how they felt about that over time. So that kind of interoperability is what I hope happens. And perhaps as we were prodded to think about in the earlier session by the person from Paradisic, who I don't know, that maybe what we need to do is start doing case studies of some of these key individuals so that we can begin that journey and get there by the end of the 10 years.
Great, thank you. David, why don't you go next?
Kia ora everyone, David Stewart. I'm the Director of Evaluation and Impact Measurement at Creative Australia. I am newish to Australia. I've been here 2 years in Sydney, and prior to coming over the ditch, I was the Research Manager at Manatū Taonga, Ministry for Culture and Heritage, which is the equivalent of the Office for the Arts in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My role is, as the sort of job title suggests, really unlock insights about the impact of arts and creativity, and to use those insights in ways that make a difference for policy, research and practice. My 3-year vision, 3 years in some respects feels really short, but actually in a project like this is really important to have things moving really quickly. But I think in 3 years' time, Creative Australia staff will be sitting down to work on the second State of Culture report, which will be hopefully a very, very important report in the kind of report landscape of Australian arts and creativity. It's a commitment under the Revive National Cultural Policy, and it is modelled or inspired by the State of the Environment report. And I would love to think that that report is so data rich and inspiring that people read it, people engage with it, and it's informed by some of the amazing work that's happening within this project. And then my little hope for the sector in 3 years' time is pretty much what others have just mentioned, that we would start to be able to tell stories of the journeys of creative practitioners and those works and how they grow and evolve and engage with audiences, and maybe even understand audience journeys as well, and that would start to produce a really powerful story about value.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, so I did have a reason for asking for 3 years rather than the I don't know, the 10-year version. I'm moving towards that. I actually heard about an organization recently doing a 500-year plan, which is provocative. But anyway, okay, if I could just really briefly pick up with Caroline and with Brioni. You've all heard from them this morning, but I wonder if, as you introduce yourselves again, if you can either add your comments on the 3-year question or pick up on things that anyone else has said. Oh, why don't you take this mic?
Okay. Okay. I've just done a whole 3-year plan in my scrapbook here. So thanks everyone for the catalysing thoughts. I'm Brioni, if anyone's just joined the room. I'm co-lead on the project with Caroline Wake based at UNSW. I'll add something because I agree with everything that's been said, and maybe my diagram is more in the 10-year version anyway. Out of some of the case studies that we will be piloting in the next 3 years, I would love to be able to advance a series of methodologies that are specific in a way to our discipline areas, but that innovate in ways that are also specific to our discipline areas, but that perhaps can catalyse some innovations in other areas as well. And I suppose what's in the back of my head is we had a lovely question in the earlier session from someone on the Zoom chat around aesthetics. So the long-term thing in my head is kind of thinking about mapping composition and aesthetics in relationship to, like, that's the inside internal point of focus, the deep driving thing of why we're in the creative arts, that to kind of the more external, you know, impact question, aesthetics and kind of impact in community and what's that story. So, yeah. Caroline?
Thanks, Brioni. My name's Caroline Wake and I'm the co-lead with Brioni, and we are both in the School of Arts and Media. And I don't normally sound like this, so I hope it lends me an air of husky authority, but my son tells me I sounded more like a frog. So I think, you know, I think I share those conceptual aspirations. I also have some really concrete ones. So one of the people I spoke to was working at a peak body, and in order to advocate was needing to pull data from sports and rec, from the National Arts Participation Survey and a couple of other places. And I just thought, wouldn't it be great if instead of scrambling across all of these websites every time, she could come to the ACHF, where she would know that Australia's cultural data was available to her, relatively searchable and usable. And so, you know, I also share ambitions around methods and creative careers and creative histories, but I also have some concrete hopes around an API and a shared ontology and some standards around Indigenous data governance that I think are ambitious, but are also doable if we focus on a couple of key pilots or case studies that can then we can build on from there.
Great, thanks. Okay, I want to come back to something, David, you said about telling the stories of practitioners. And one thing that I think would connect all of us in our disciplinary work is telling stories, or working on storytelling, or using narrative in research ways. I wonder if I could ask Scott and Chris to talk about how you imagine the telling of stories via the work of a visual artist / designer.
Do you want to go first, Chris, or I guess I might start with telling the story of the DAO a little bit. It was created originally out of a publication project, Joan Kerr's Dictionary of Australian Artists. And when she was diagnosed with cancer and unfortunately passed away, it was decided to put her research online to tell the stories of Australian artists. And because if we don't tell our stories, those stories are kind of lost. And so I think that DAO is a really important source of 17,000 Australian artists and designers' stories. And there's so much data richness in there already that it's hard to kind of focus on telling any one particular story. Yeah, I'm hoping through this project that we'll find ways of telling stories across data sets and across the project. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I'll pass over to Chris.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the notion of a designer is helpful from our point of view because they're intrinsically someone working across art forms. And so when you are interrogating someone's body of work solely through a single art form, it's not giving you the richness of the picture, and it's not showing you the development of a portfolio career, or it's not showing you how a shared aesthetic might have developed over time. And so one of the areas that we can look at is that the DAO and Ozstage both have set designer as a contributor function. So you can immediately see, here's everybody in the DAO who has a credit as a set designer on a particular project, and here's everybody on Ozstage who has a credit as a set designer on a particular project. And that from there you can start to think about flow. How did that career move from one sector to another? Was someone like Bill Constable working in the theatre and working as a watercolorist and a landscape painter and moving back and forth, or did the practice start outside the theatre and move into the theatre? Or when designers start moving into film, how does that then create a different type of career pathway? And we can start with designers, I think, because of that inherent kind of multimodal or multi-genre work. But actors are similar. That there are many actors who have a contributor function in Ozstage, but who are also represented in ACME's data set. The same with other types of film work. And so to take a really basic example, we have this pervasive narrative in the live performing arts that you start off on stage and then you make it into film, and then your film career takes off, and then every so often maybe you come back and do a kind of legacy show for the STC, and that, but your film career is really where it's working. But when we interrogate the Ozstage data set and the ACME data set, and more recently, Deb Verhoeven and her collaborators have published an amazing open access data set of Australian film across time, we can see that an Australian actor doesn't have that progression. There's obviously the outlier examples, but most working actors are moving back and forth, picking up collaborators as they go, and that the lighting designer on a theatre production that might then come into the technical team for the next film project. And we can see the development of the industry in different ways when we can map that out. Whereas if you're looking solely at one art form or one data set, you're getting a kind of partial picture. It's a long-winded answer, but hopefully it gives you a sense of that. I think it's the notion of flow really that's at the heart of it, and how an artistic career becomes networked over time.
So your example is one example, and there could be many other types of overlaps or intersections that ACHF could also explore. Okay, great. Lisa Marie, you mentioned something in your comments about how you felt ACHF would be empowering the sector. And I'd like to just turn to the sector for a minute. And I'd like you, and in fact, everybody, to think about to what extent the ACHF will provide a brokering of new partnerships between the academy and creative practice. And why might this be so important now? And how does it position artists? It's a very broad question. I'm interested in anyone's take.
I don't necessarily think that the sector would see a data base as something driven by an institution, even though it may sit in institutions. There will also always be that sense of mistrust. You know, the researcher is the dirtiest word for a lot of practitioners in our sector. And it's very difficult for them to engage the sector in ideas or projects that are research driven or institutionally driven. So that's why I think it would best work if they feel as though, and I say they because I'm not working in the sector at the moment, have autonomy over or input into how that works for them, and that, you know, perhaps there's even a way that I'm thinking also about international service orgs, like Indigenous performing arts in Canada, Turtle Island. You know, I'm not sure what's in Aotearoa, you know, maybe someone can enlighten us on that. But also joining those, because those relationships are not being mapped. There are a lot of projects that go on, and indeed the Australia Council has invested a lot of money in First Nations exchanges, as have, you know, APAM and the Western Arts Alliance. So there are projects that come out of that and collaborations that are not being mapped either, or that kind of international mobility. But we know, and we have the narratives, and we try to document those narratives as best we can, either on our websites, but those narratives aren't being generated. So we're still holders of our own stories, but those, you know, who carries those stories and for how long, and, you know, we talked about where they go next. It's having trust in not necessarily organisations or institutions, but in a kind of collaboration of organisations to assist with that. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Anyone else like to weigh in on that? Well, I think that's a no.
Can add something. I think, yeah, just something that's really top of mind, I think, for all of us at the moment is that we are within the project talking a lot about cultural data without always knowing that that's the same thing that the sector means by cultural data, or the same thing that artists mean by cultural data. One of the fantastic things that's come out of the landscape analysis piece that Carolyn and Brioni have led is this, like, really asking artists and people in the industry, what is data for you and how do you use it? And that doesn't really map directly onto the ways that we as Ozstage talk about data, or even we as theatre researchers talk about data. And so that, for me, that's going to be a great piece of work that this project can lead, is to kind of make sure that there's a shared understanding of what constitutes cultural data between the sector, between the industry and the researchers and individual artists, so that when we talk about these things, it doesn't become abstract. That when we go and speak to an amateur theatre organisation in outback Queensland and say, we want your data, that they actually understand that what we're talking about is a kind of particular type of thing that will empower them, to use Lisa Marie's word, to think differently about their history, or to connect their work with work going on around the country. And that perhaps sometimes that the terminology is what's tripped us up before now, and that the space that this project has taken to really understand that, and the work that's being done to really dig into those differing kind of valencies of data and cultural data is really important.
Well, if we could move on from the valencies of terminology, what about the valencies of gaps? Is there an issue with filling gaps, or is that just not something that is relevant in ACHF at this point? Helena, I know you were interested in identifying gaps at one point, or being able to compare the digitization project that you've been working on in WA to work that takes place elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, we did talk this morning a little bit. Well, sorry, not we. Caroline and Brioni talked about when they were asked a question, I think by Lisa Marie, might have been your question, about, you know, digitization and the fact that there isn't a digitization strategy or focus at the moment in the project. Yes, Caroline, I'm looking at you. Yeah, sorry, just checking I'm not off the ball here. So I guess that could be considered a gap, but if you think about the huge ambitions of this project, it may not be a gap because there's so much other important work to do. But in terms of gaps, the gaps I was concerned about were gaps that happen after you have digitized things. So it's not quite in the same realm as this project, because this project is dealing with material that's already there. I suppose the gaps for this project is how do you ensure that you have enough of a chunk from each of the organizations that you're working on. If we go back to that idea of following a company or a performer, you know, how do you make sure that you get everything and that then you can smush it together in a way that flows, to go back to that point.
Lisa Marie.
You just dropped out. I'm just thinking about that mapping idea and extracting reports, extracting the data, creating reports. I'm thinking about what Jonathan did with some of the archive, with the Wolanski archive, and he created visual maps of where things sprung up around Sydney. And I thought that was really accessible. So I'm really interested in the thinking around what kind of artistic outcomes that may, you know, getting artists to respond as a project to data or in a visual way. Being able to run reports, and like I see that as a report, I see those visual representations or artistic responses to data as being reports.
Right. Lisa Marie's referring to Jonathan Boland, who used to be at UNSW, has had a long history with Ozstage and now teaches in Taiwan. Anyone else want to jump in on that idea? Okay, Chris, and then Caroline.
I think, just be interested from the point of view of the data sets about gaps. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that a lot of the use of databases like Ozstage is kind of presumes that they're kind of encyclopedic, right? That someone thinks, oh, was it dinner last night and someone said, oh, so I could use Ozstage to find out who played that role when I went to see Les Mis in 1991. And like, yes, you can type that in and you can find it and you can see it. But there is a kind of presumption, I think, that it's authoritative and that it's all there. But it's not, in fact, all there. And that although we have aspirations to have a really broad coverage, when you say the database is attempting to capture live performance in Australia from 1789 to the present day, it's not all going to be there. And so there is an inevitability to gaps in that sense. And that part of what we need to do, and part of the work that we're doing through the project, is empowering people who stumble into them to fill them, or to bring, when you can identify a gap, that means you're the person who can tell us what's not there and where do we need to be looking, and how can we make sure that someone who finds a gap doesn't send an irritated email, but instead says, how can I sign up to become a data entry specialist to help fill that gap? Or I can tell you the person who has the answer to that question. And again, that's something that's at the heart of the project in terms of the sector capacity uplift that Carolyn and Briony were talking about.
And that comes back to your point about generating a national ecosystem as well. Caroline? It's going to have to Scott, actually.
Okay. I'm painfully aware of the DAO's limitations and its gaps, and especially for contemporary artists, it's a huge area of gap in the database, and it's really about brokering that potential to have more community members interested in contributing to a website like this. And so I'm hoping the project will increase visibility for the project and increase our community of users as well.
Terrific. And Caroline, do you want to? No? Okay.
I might just pick up on that. I think a gap that the project needs to address is around those different user audiences or stakeholder groups. So this picks up on your earlier question too about, is this an opportunity, how do we relate to the sector, or what's the nature of this opportunity? I think there's a huge amount of we need to, I'm trying to find the right words, raise awareness or be able to showcase the utility of these databases for people located in the sector. So when we're talking about that expanded researcher person, we need to kind of go to X arts organisation and say, once your record is in here and it speaks to these other records, this is the kind of data that you can generate. At the moment, I don't think all sector-based members see themselves in some of those databases, but that is our job, is to actually address that gap and also showcase how they can see themselves in them, I think. Yeah.
Go on, go for it. Lisa Marie.
I'm just thinking, I used to be on the board of Australian Plays, and they have a data set that's now been inherited by Australian Plays Transforms. And there were always discussions about what belonged there and what people considered to be theatre works. You know, I think Hilary Bell was always pushing for musicals to be in there, and to even hold the compositions as well and make those available, because you can get the play, but you couldn't get the compositions, the music to go with it. So there was, you know, defining those, I guess, boundaries or parameters of these, you know, what goes in there and what doesn't, and where they sit under what genre. I mean, are we creating genres? And I'm even thinking about Indigenous theatre. Is it, you know, well, I know how we define it, but, you know, is that the same for everybody? And which would need to be, you know, from the sector generated. But yeah, just talking about the language, you know, developing a kind of universal language really that everybody understands. And I guess from the conversation that I'm hearing, I'm really excited about this not being us and them. I'm really excited that it's something that the sector has a very big key role in, because ultimately they may be the ones that take it. And I don't know in what way, in what form, but that's, you know, if you're looking further ahead, you know, the way that we work in our sector is you always do something in order to give it back. And that give back is really important. So making sure they're on the journey with us and not feeling, you know, researched or you know, information extracted, that it's really creating this importance for them as well, or for them to understand the importance of what it might mean in the future.
Great, thanks. So a slightly related question. These database resources have been developed for different reasons by different people, not necessarily the people here, and in some cases in different eras, certainly different technological eras. So how do you anticipate ACHF will overcome the difficulties that these different entities present? Or perhaps overcoming is not the right verb. How will you work with the technical intricacies, the different approaches, any of those?
I mean, I guess it's one of the challenges of the project, but I guess it's through conversations that are outside of disciplinary silos. So it's about trying to speak with the sector, and across art forms is one of the strengths of the project. The fact that we're bringing a lot of different voices from government, from the sector, from research together means we're getting the right people in the room to have those conversations. So I don't think we'll overcome them, but it's part of the challenge that we're working with.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, I think in a way that's probably familiar to many people in the room, Ausstage developed through a series of LEAF grants, and the database had a phenomenally successful track record of attracting funding under that scheme. I think there were 7 LEAF grants in total over 20 years. But the LEAF scheme funded 1 to 2 max years of work and prioritized new additions. And so each of the additions to the database was a kind of add-on. And the nature of the funding scheme didn't always give us time to look back over it and say, well, what do we have now? How do we make sure all of those additions through 7 different phases have been speaking to each other or have been integrated with each other? So in terms of on the technical level, in terms of the code of the database, there's code there from day one, and there's code there from last week. And obviously all sorts of technical innovation across that time. So the kind of expanded scope that this opportunity represents gives us the time and the perspective to go back and say, well, how do we integrate all of those things back together? I've been doing a bit of work at the moment around the endings principles, which were developed out of the University of Victoria in Canada.
I'm sorry, the what principles?
The endings principles. So this idea of, well, what do you do when the project ends? So, and one of the key things in those principles is you make your database design as simple as possible so that it's replicable, so that it's not taking up huge amounts of space, so that it's in programming languages that are still in use, rather than being a bespoke platform. We've heard, I think, across these 2 days about those different challenges. And so that's sort of what we're working towards, is to say, well, how do we make sure that the database as an object at the end of this cycle is as simple as possible, having had this long development period that kind of led us through different stages that didn't always speak back to what was there before.
I would just also add that as a non-technical person in this project, I think what's going to be really important is kind of careful and slow listening to each of the different entities involved about what it would take for their technology to speak to someone else's, and using those case studies to test and retest so that you get the maximum sort of success out of that desire for those databases to be able to speak a shared language, or at least in some respects to share material. So yeah, I think slowly and carefully is the way to go.
Good. Lisa Marie.
I'm thinking about the centralization. It feels like there's a bit of an shrinkage, but at the moment we're thinking of bringing everything in. It feels like that. That's what, that's what I hear. We're getting all these things and we're going to make them all, talk to each other, and it feels like a little centralization. I don't say that in a bad way. What I'm thinking of is this kind of, what is it? Shrinkage. There's another word. Before it explodes again, like before it goes back out, like it contracts. That's the word. It contracts, and I feel like it's in a contracting moment before it then, we'll go back out, and there will be some kind of, I talk about that ownership again of people looking after or caring for their parts within the whole.
Great. Okay.
I think, the word overcome is not necessarily where we're headed, in the sense that every database has a specific history and often a specific disciplinary history. And we in theatre and performance will always need event-oriented data, because that is our primary kind of site of analysis. Whereas those in the visual arts may be less interested in the event. They might be interested in a particular exhibition, but they might come at it from a biographical angle, which is why they will always need the DAO. And likewise, Creative Australia and ACME have, particular need, they will need to keep and maintain their data because they have legislative requirements to do so. So we are likely looking at, I don't think facilitating some kind of central search across, a federated kind of model. And that is where the work is to be done. But I think we also need to be realistic, which is that there are just some terms or some fields that are specific to a particular discipline and can't or won't necessarily be, you know, solved. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So Chris mentioned earlier that he's seeing ACHF in terms of the national ecosystem. I'm wondering, David, if we can come back to you in terms of a national cultural policy. Is there an argument for ACHF contributing either literally or figuratively to a national cultural policy?
Absolutely. In theory, policy gets developed through a sort of mixture of sort of needs analysis, surveying what is and what might be, engaging and talking and listening, bringing all that together, looking at different options and coming up with some policy that is high quality, feasible. I haven't mentioned politics but I just had mentioned politics because that is part of the evidence engagement. Politics all kind of comes together in the policymaking process. I have absolutely no doubt that the better, more coordinated and therefore stronger story that we can tell through data can only help the policy process. It's never going to be the only thing. If you can do that in combination with good timing, good advocacy, people who can speak to that data in a very kind of, I guess, two-speed way of here's the big picture, here's what it actually means for that artist or this person growing up in this country, this person in the bush, etc. And so that's you know, I think that this project can make a really big contribution to that. It's a wider kind of sector effort to have that influence on policy.
Great. Does anyone else want to pick up on that as well? David, could you just, I'm going to put you on the spot for a moment. Could you just tell us a little bit more about exactly how you anticipate Creative Australia contributing to ACHF?
Yeah, in some ways I'm a bit of a fraud because I'm on this sort of evaluation side, and this project is sort of really picking up our research folks. I think, as I said earlier, you know, Creative Australia sits on a absolute, I won't call it a gold mine because we haven't turned it into gold, but it sits on some land that contains something in there. And that goes back decades. And just listening before, you know, obviously we have had system iterations, and you know, I can't even find a Word document about our evaluation policy from 7 or 8 years ago. So I sort of like, oh my goodness, where's, you know, what's happened to our data? But we are a big link in the chain. Like all of these databases will have names and works and ideas that have had a contribution from Creative Australia at some point, usually money. But other things as well. So it is about joining, enabling, you know, our dots to join with those other dots and to chart that journey. So I think it's a little thing. It's a little thing, but it's major. And I think as well, speaking to, you know, the different reasons this data is collected, ours is possibly a very unique set of reasons legislatively required to collect data, but also we're grant administrators. We provide funding and we create a mechanism to first assess applicants and then sort of basically see what happened. And that's an accountability exercise. And there's obviously a lot of scrutiny of how we can improve that and streamline it and make it more about outcomes and outputs, etc. But that's the relationship that we've created as a default. And I think, you know, that's where I think probably there's a few sticky points in sort of extracting that for a sort of what's now become a secondary use, but a very important use. I think we can do it, but I think that's the, you know, that would be the goal for, you know, Creative Australia to be part of that, you know, part of that federation or part of that sort of series of dots. I would love to be able to see those pathways of creative practice and creativity and see where our data fits in. We're struggling to even do that internally at the moment, yeah, to be honest, but that's the goal.
And obviously Creative Australia has a lot of sensitive data, so this is never going to be a hand over everything to ACHF kind of relationship. I'm just kind of clarifying for everyone that
Yeah,
you won't be able to.
I don't know. We're not sitting on sort of scandals and you know, yeah. I mean, it's information that was collected for a different purpose,
Yeah.
and there was never permissions
Right.
received for certain types of use. That said, I always say a little bit of data can go a long way, and you know, just this non-sensitive data that, you know, we can be doing a lot more with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm just clarifying that there are sensitivities with your participation, and it's great to hear that you're generous in what you would like to contribute, but that there are some limitations. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to ask a bit about skills and skill building and what skills you think are necessary. And that might be among those of you in specific research databases, as well as the general users or even the specific users that you imagine for ACHF. What do you need? What has to be built skill-wise? And I guess I'm thinking back, I don't remember who said this yesterday, but someone talked about Excel spreadsheets potentially being redundant. So I don't know if it's even at the very basic level that users of ACHF will need help, or if we can anticipate a fair degree of knowledge. Helena.
Earlier today in their presentation, and I don't mean to speak for you, Caroline and Brioni did talk about the need for the sector to be upskilled across the sector. So I don't know if they want to elaborate on what that is at this point.
I think also, sorry, I think also it's as much as it's skills, it's culture that needs to be changed, because I think there's already skills in the sector, they just need to be transferred. But it's changing the culture around why do they need to participate? Why do they need to engage with this space as much as it is about skill?
Can I just, a couple of people have mentioned, and I really want to reinforce it, so communication of data, and I find data can become a bit of a product rather than something that has utility to engage and answer really important questions. And I think just having the data there, even having it in ways that are searchable, etc., is great. But you know, people who can persuade, people who can be curious and explore and understand how to make linkages. And I often think, you know, with data, like one piece of not great data plus another piece of not great data suddenly starts to produce something that's a little bit greater than the sum of the parts. So yeah, I think just, you know, communicators, visualizers, persuaders, influencers.
Caroline, you picked up a mic?
Well, Helena handed me a mic. Yeah, so a couple of things. I think it's partly about skill. It's not as much as about skill as we anticipated. So one of the hypotheses we took into the landscape analysis or hunches we had was that the skill level in the sector is not especially high. But one of the things that, and certainly yeah, that's the narrative coming from some funding agencies, for instance, not necessarily Creative Australia, but others that we've spoken to. But when we went into the conversations with artists and arts organisations and researchers based at universities, actually some of them have quite high levels of skill. They're very adept at managing data, have quite sophisticated practices. They don't necessarily have the time and resources. So when I would push of like, are you part of a team? No. Is there a dedicated person? No. Was it written into anyone's position description? No. So it's not part of any workflow currently, which means that it is absolutely the last thing to get done. And it also means that there are, in the same way that Creative Australia can't find its Word document from whenever year, it means that sometimes they're actually parking data in acquittals. And then in order to find that data sort of, which they've actually sort of handled, like collected, curated, analysed very carefully, but just to retrieve it, they're like sifting through a portal or just trying to remember which year it was. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Brioni. There's definitely upskilling to be done.
Yeah, it might be a step back from your question or something about the process by which we do the upskilling. So we've just got the survey results. They're not quite finished. We've just done all these interviews. There's more to go. Our hypotheses have changed because of that. So that in a way has kind of changed to the extent that it can, the process that might follow next. I think we have a big wish to be able to keep some of those conversations alive and to build momentum and to kind of make visible the high skill level through some fora that maybe there's a bit of, if the members of the sector are willing and able to do some of that sharing, what is it that they do in these really kind of under-resourced situations? What would make it easier? I would like that to be informing. So we didn't get to that level of detail within our initial conversations, but I think, what could we do I suppose it's about acknowledging the skills that's there, helping people share the different methods that they have. And I said before in our rehearsal conversation for this, I think there's something going on here as well around interoperability of methods, so that when we're working with sector, like the question before about what is Creative Australia bringing? I can't answer that for you, but I have a sense of what's alive for me in some of our often tricky conversations about how to do the technical solve is kind of learning from, well, how do you do X, Y, and Z? How would we do X, Y, and Z? What's a middle ground? Or like, what are the multifaceted prongs that would bring some of those methods together to create a rich picture as well? So that's somehow connected to skill, but is probably the deeper 3 to 10 year version of where we're going. Yeah.
At the moment, also a lot of that data is being stored on very fragile platforms, and because it's often the cheapest platform that companies can afford. And the thing that Australia Council did do not so long ago was invest in digital infrastructure for small to medium companies. And that was through the provision of a worker, and digital, can be interpreted in various ways. And a lot of it was creating those platforms to store data, but also using social media as data storage, in websites, in Facebook pages. That's where all the data's being. It's kind of like not a placebo. Proxy. Thank you. Needs words fed to me sometimes. A proxy data site. Yeah.
I wanted to add one thing that is, and I actually haven't had a chance to discuss this with Brioni. I have been wondering, the arts as a workforce is highly feminised, and where I see, and this has not been mentioned in any of the discussions about skills across the days, but I have started to wonder, to what extent are we dealing with a miniature version of the women in STEM problem? Like when I'm thinking about the quantitative avoidance sometimes that comes through in conversations, it's just in the background for me around to what extent that's a factor.
That's really interesting.
It is
Marie?
interesting because a lot of the people who will go for those digital jobs, they will be men. And so then they're charged with the data maintenance, which is not necessarily how they saw themselves when they applied for the job as filers. But that's normally what they end up doing as part of their role. But I agree with you when you were talking about, you know, why are not these skills in job descriptions? And I think that's a really easy step to do, is to get companies to change that culture of their digital managers or digital project officers or assistants to take on those roles around assisting with the data. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much.
I think this is, for me, just one thing to add is that one of our kind of nascent discoveries, I think, is that actually data literacy in the sector is sometimes higher than it is in the academic field. A lot of our colleagues who make use of our data sets don't make them, don't know how they work necessarily, and use them as a sort of fact-checking device or a footnoting device. And I think, Joanne, you've probably been in rooms with people downloading spreadsheets and going, what next? You know, when someone says, oh, you've got to do some data cleaning to produce the visualization, and suddenly there's no way forward. And so if we want our colleagues and our students to be making more sophisticated uses of our data, we have to buy into that and firstly upskill them, but also be able to present that data in more usable ways. And again, I think that's something that this project is really going to be leaning heavily on some of the other projects in the Hassan IRDC, pardon me, to think about how we present the data that's actually extracted from the databases in ways that can then facilitate their really smooth use by some of the other tools that have been developed, or by the tools that our project itself develops. Because I think the more that we can do to model those more sophisticated uses of data within our own research and with our own colleagues, the better the kind of buy-in to the longevity of these projects and these databases. If we continue to have fewer and fewer of our colleagues and students making use of the data sets, there's not going to be anyone left to hold them up at the end of the day.
Okay, one last question before we open it up to the audience. To what extent do you anticipate ACHF engaging with Indigenous research priorities and capabilities? And I know that you've got Nina Gray as an Indigenous Research Fellow. Perhaps in her absence, one of you could also tell us what her portfolio is.
I think, Caroline, you're better. Oh, yeah.
Got two of them.
Oh, yeah. Caroline's been working more closely with Nina more recently anyway. Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Joanne? What's the...
Thank you. How do you imagine ACHF engaging with Indigenous research priorities and capabilities?
Well, I think the starting point will be with companies like Mugalan, for example, and artists like Lisa Marie, where in our search for information and literature about Indigenous data governance in the arts, we've come up short and realised there's next to no research and support there, and actually that will be the best way to develop it. And that part of the reason we're interested in speaking to self-determined companies is because a lot of the literature is around repair and reparative description in mainstream institutions. So that will be, I think, where we will start. There is another piece of work in the ontologies which goes to, as Lisa Marie said, genre, and it reminds me of that essay, Your Genre is Black. You know, to what extent Indigenous appears as a genre in a data model, or to what extent actually it was Indigenous-led and Indigenous authored, but the genre is comedy. You know, so there are some actual technical changes that need to happen in order to facilitate better community engagement and more appropriate representation, I think. Do you want to add something?
Yeah. I think in some of the meetings that we've had with the stakeholders who generally come from other sectors who already have established data sites and that they manage, a lot of the conversation too is around, protocols, repatriation, but it's also around, storage of sensitive materials, language, people who have passed away, name changes when people pass away, those kind of little detailed things around care and curatorial care of the site or of where that information sits. That's the kind of conversations that are happening at the moment. And it's interesting because, the site has a kind of creative in the name, but also it's not something that other types of databases have thought about. So there's cultural heritage is something that's really familiar, but cultural expression is not. Holding stories, holding language, holding dance, painting, that type of thing is often not necessarily a narrative that people understand across database sectors.
No, well, I don't want to pass the question further on to Chris, but Chris, I'm remembering one of our potential case studies was kind of looking at or the corroboree data set in Ausstage and how that might be kind of, the categories around that might be opened out to kind of, to capture some of the nuances beyond, that exist beyond existing genres, etc. Is that,
Yeah, I mean, there is a data set that exists within Ausstage that records instances of commercial corroboree in the 19th century. And that paints a really rich picture of how corroboree was commercialized. But when that data set was put in, there was a series of conversations around what constitutes performance for the purposes of a live performance database. And the determination that was made at the time in consultation with Indigenous colleagues was that anything that had been advertised, that had an admission fee, that was framed as a commercial experience, could be entered into the database for general consumption. But whenever that wasn't clear, that it needed to not sit in the database in a way where it could be accessed by any user. And so as a result, that data is not sitting in a part of the database that connects to the other sections. And so one of the useful affordances of this project is to revisit those conversations in the context of the evolution of fair and care principles since that data set was first developed. That data set paints a rich picture of a very specific moment in time, but it also skews the presentation of Indigenous performance in Ausstage, because when you go in and look at it, you go, oh, well, there was this huge kind of movement here and then it went away. But actually that's a result of a series of curatorial choices that need to be constantly interrogated.
Yeah, and sorry, I just want to talk to that too. These are the conversations we had at a national dance forum in 2010, and that was contemporary dance and cultural dance. And I know that there were times often the database gets populated by particular people looking after those data sets as well. Like I know Mary Rose had a big key role in the Black Stage, and hence the paper that came out of that was based on that research, and perhaps there was a need to house that material that Mary Rose accessed from somewhere else, and wanted, in a caring way, wanted to find a place to hold that. But they're conversations that are still had within the sector around, there is no database for cultural dance, and we know that cultural dance is community based, and that there are so many cultural dance groups around the country that it could, that's a whole other area that we shouldn't even touch really, because I don't think it's our place. That should be managed and run by an Aboriginal organisation for cultural dance. So there are things that it's about inclusion and exclusion, I guess, or what is the site not even permitted to do, but
What's appropriate?
what's appropriate to
Yeah.
do. Yeah, what should
Yeah.
should and shouldn't be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it borders on that anthropological, film and sound archive has a lot of that material anyway. And so, maybe it might even be linking to that if that's a thing that the sector says they want to do.
Yeah. Lisa Marie's referring to Mary Rose Casey, a researcher who's done a lot of work on Indigenous Australian theatre.
Sorry, I'm just going bubbling now because, I mean, when Mary Rose wrote that book on Indigenous theatre and the chronology at the back, that was the first time anybody had kind of extracted all that information and put it in one place. I mean, that was groundbreaking. But, that finished in 2000. It's 26 years ago and there is still not another piece of work that has documented our history. Yeah.
And just to go back to Chris's point, it may well be that Paradisic can, there's a good conversation to be had between Ausstage and Paradisic about Indigenous material that is not appropriate to be available for the public. Okay, we're very quickly getting towards 3 o'clock, but I do want to give an opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. PT. Oh, sorry, we've got all the mics. Here, let me bring one to you. Oh, there's one up there. Okay.
So I've got a fun question and then a kind of more speculative thing. So why do we need this when we've got honey? So if anybody wants to say anything about that, that'd be great. But I also wanted to, so this is a really interesting discussion. I'm wondering if anybody would venture what technically might this look like? So people have talked about catalogues and things in the other streams. So is anybody brave enough to answer one of those two questions, like what it might look like and the other one?
I mean, I can have a go at the honey question. In the sense that, like, I think honey is a really a valuable resource that also is a kind of cautionary tale for this kind of work, because honey requires a degree of upkeep and a degree of kind of constant care and attention that it's not funded to provide. And so the utility of honey as a workbench is only only useful insofar as it's kind of cared for. And I think one of the things that we've talked about within this project and that other projects that have worked within this space and really led the conversations that we're building on, like the Australian Cultural Data Engine that Rachel Fensham and colleagues led, is to say that we don't want to create another piece of infrastructure that has a huge administrative burden that can't be undertaken without a constant funding source. And so I think that comes back to one of the things that Carolyn was saying about developing an interoperability solution that is then plugged back into the existing data sets so that people can be making use of the affordances of the interoperability without creating a kind of separate workbench or data cathedral or something that then itself generates this kind of administrative burden that we're already carrying from our own individual projects. Yeah, that would be my attempt at answering that question.
And what about the second question? Is it perhaps a little bit premature to?
Come on, people must be speculating, right?
I mean, we are. We had a working day at UNSW in October where by the end of the day, some of us were chomping at the bit asking that very question, what's it going to look like? What's it going to look like? And the answer is we don't know yet. So we'll come back next year with either a smorgasbord of possibilities or some decisions, but we're kind of, I don't know, Caroline might have a more kind of concrete answer, but but we don't. We're kind of working through possibilities, and I think actually some of the case studies might drive what it is going to look like, which also then gets back to some of the stuff we were talking about on Monday around process and project design and project agility, as well.
Just got one little other thing. I'm just seeing it like this beautiful word, the data cathedral. And then I'm thinking about the house, and then I'm thinking about the anti-cathedral. Like what happens, like once it's done, then does it when all that memory belongs in one place or across other places, it doesn't then belong to anybody. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we're necessarily thinking of a house or a cathedral.
Oh.
So, and that's exactly why we haven't made that decision yet. So I think your point goes to why we, you know, we are treading carefully and listening closely as per Helena's recommendation.
Okay, we've got two hands. I saw Kylie's first and then Rachel's. Sorry, Rachel's got the mic already, so she goes first.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I was actually going to follow up on with you, David, from OSCO, because I did a project a few years ago which was involving Creative Victoria, and we were doing some data analysis of regional theatre companies in Victoria, and we produced the data sets, and they were partners to that project for the whole 3 years. And the more I said, oh, couldn't we just get some of your data? Could we have a download of what those companies are doing? Could we find out the 3-year plan, you know? And in the end, we told them stories about the companies that they funded that then shifted the policy landscape for Creative Victoria, because we actually managed to show that certain areas of the state weren't being resourced, that state school, high schools weren't accessing the productions that did tour of Bell Shakespeare. And so anyway, and on and on, I won't go on about it. But I guess I just really wanted to press you a little bit harder on what realistically would, because I think about this project is that OSCO is a partner to it, and that's a real coup for the project. But realistically, what could be released, however small, and what kind of server is it currently on, and what sort of data structures does it currently have that could be useful for the sector, you know, and as I say, however small, and what does it need to unlock it? So I guess I'm kind of like, take one example and just say, well, what could you imagine OSCO might do to unlock its data? Because it's going to be incredibly valuable to the sector, I think.
Yeah, just when you were mentioning that example, I sort of thought, you know, surely we can explore that data in-house in collaboration with a researcher and come up with some really amazing insights. I don't actually know the boundary of what should be out there versus what shouldn't be. I do have a bit of a concern about like people mention, you know, this notion of outputs to outcomes. Outputs is the easy stuff for us to collect and aggregate. Someone like me coming from an evaluation background where you just sort of drilled into you, context matters and everything is different everywhere. I do have some question about what kind of how far down you go into context, because if you're really wanting to explore outcomes, you need to understand very specific objectives, a very specific context, very specific, what I'd call a theory of change, or sort of what are the mechanisms that are operating here? What are the goals? What are the timeframes, the horizons? What are the communities of focus here within this context? And multiply that by thousands and thousands of organizations that we fund. So I do think that the idea of getting all the stuff out there and making it available versus my bias towards privilege and context sort of brings me into a bit of a conflict here. But I think for that scenario, like, we should be able to do that now. We should be able to internally interrogate that data to answer valuable questions like that. And we do, but we're even internally doing that against the natural inclination of the database to be about an accountability mechanism for grants versus a research tool. So, you know, we're trying to overcome that tension internally, but also as part of our contribution to this project.
Caroline, did you want to say something? And Chris had his finger up as well.
Oh, sure, you go first, Chris.
Oh, sure. I just thought maybe I could give you an example, Rachel, of something that we're working on that is a kind of coming directly out of the Creative Australia data, and that's thinking about the Playing Australia data set. So that's touring data, and that is really a really great, useful thing for us, because often a show that's got Playing Australia funding to tour has had an original performance, so it already has an Ausstage record. So when that show then gets funded for a tour, one of the things we're talking to Creative Australia and through the data team and the research team is how could Creative Australia put the data of what was funded into a form that could enable it to be just fed into Ausstage straight away, and so that the touring data would then feed directly from Creative Australia into Ausstage, and you would then be able to use an in-house visualization tool within Ausstage to go, great, where did that tour go? Here's a map, there it is. And all that's required there is a small change to the presentation of the data from Creative Australia's side and a small change to the way that we do data entry from the Ausstage side. So they don't feel like huge obstacles. That's helpful for us because firstly, there's almost always an original Ausstage record that can be transposed into the touring record, but also because it's a reasonably bounded data set, the Playing Australia one. So it's things like that I think are, the more of those little things we can find to demonstrate how that reaches out, the better the case we can make for the larger data sets, I think. Sorry, Carolyn.
I know you took one of my examples, Chris. That's fine. No, so Rachel, I think from conversations with David and also other Creative Australia staff, in particular Caitlin Vaughan and Rebecca Mostyn, Creative Australia, we've focused the conversation today on what can they make available. In some instances, it is already available. It's just not in a usable format. So the touring data is the classic example. There's funding data back to 2015, and if you use Wayback Machine, you can get all the PDFs with all the funding data back to the early 1990s. So that's just about a format issue in a way. So there are some, not low-hanging fruit, but like relatively easy, already accessible data sets that they would be easy for them. On the split of they often talk about the difference between research and administrative data. Research data will never exit the organisation, I don't think necessarily, or it might in particular circumstances, but we don't expect that to become public or to feed into the project. And then, as David said, there's a decision to be made around administrative data that was collected for another purpose and what of that from grant acquittals can come through. And there are some early promising signs, but
Last brief question to Kylie.
Okay, it was going to be wrapped up with so many things, but I'm just going to ask this question, and it builds on what Peter asked before about what does it technically look like? What does it visually look like? So what I'd love to see is like an artistic, creative visualization of this infrastructure that is intelligible to a range of audiences. So that translates into the sector, whoever the sector is. I think you mean the art sector broadly, but you're also talking about addressing researchers and whatnot and intergovernment, and that might need to be tweaked for, but is it an ecosystem? Is it, because we've all got these analogies and metaphors, ecosystem, dashboard, pipelines, cathedrals, whatever, we're grasping. So I guess visually, like, what does it look like? And you might not be able to answer that yet, but I think that will be brilliant to get to grips with.
What if it was different for everybody who accessed it? So you had an AI-driven aesthetic at the back of it. So when you came in as an artist, it would be a visual kind of site to access, and you came in as a performing artist, it probably had a very different aesthetic, but the AI was driving that every time you logged in.
I love it.
She can't talk. She's dying here.
Something which is, it's an excellent question, Kylie. And again, I don't think we've answered it, but we could potentially, we haven't really mentioned ACME in closing, and it might be a nice point to mention ACME because they have a wonderful exhibition at the moment I mentioned in the introduction speech, called Constellations, and we've briefly, like, there's all kinds of metaphors going on in the background here, but can we run with constellations for now? So leaning on their IP, but that's again kind of a way to focus, I suppose, centres of, well, I think of them as centres of energy, artistic focus, and their reverberations out. So it can be kind of place-based, it can be anchored in time, it can also map people. And it can, you know, we've had other people in lunch talk about it can map a whole lot of trajectories. And what's lovely about their Constellations exhibition is it's an exhibition, it's curated. So I'm not quite sure how that fits with what we will end up, ideally we're not curating, but we might curate moments, which are kind of the moments that are readable, and they can be curated around, you know, themes, etc. So they're way ahead in terms of that, thinking about how to communicate the crossfeed, the ecosystem. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Kristen has a microphone, but we're over time. Can we manage one more, or do we need to close it now? Okay. All right. All right. Kristen, go for it.
Sure. It's probably more of a comment, so we don't have to go on for too long. This applies, I guess, to ACHF, but also across all of the projects. I'm kind of feeling, after listening to everything that you've been saying about Indigenous data governance, but also coming back to the other projects, it feels like there's a little bit of a disconnect, that in the HAS and I and Indigenous RDC, there is a project, the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities project, that centralises our work on Indigenous data governance. And I just wonder whether we can't have a little bit more of a cohesive approach across the entire RDC. The work we're doing really is trying to look at all disciplinary areas. So it's just a comment that I think that maybe the ARDC can do something to bring us all together in order to make sure that we are embedding Indigenous data governance in similar ways, and ways that interconnect and make sense across all of the work. So that was my comment.
Thank you. That is a wonderful way to wrap up the session. So Chris, Lisa Marie, Caroline, Helena, Scott, David, Brioni, thank you very much for a very informative session. Thanks.
And thank you,
Help me join in thanking.
Thank you, Joanne.
And we have